My name is not Eris Thorne. It's a name the government gave me more than 30 years ago. A name on a driver's license and a social security card that belonged to a man who doesn't exist. The real me, the person I was before, died in 1989 in a quiet, sterile room in Fort Meade, Maryland. He died the day I signed the non-disclosure agreement that erased my past and swore me to a lifetime of silence. I am making this recording because I have come to believe that some oaths are meant to be broken, especially the ones made to protect monsters. The official report on the Olympic National Forest geological incident, file number USAMRID EID 89-734, is a lie. A complete and total fabrication, from the first word to the last. I know this, you see, because I was one of the principal authors of that lie. I helped invent the rare, localized neurotoxin released by a subterranean gas pocket. I helped draft the theoretical framework for its effect on the human optic nerve. It was a beautiful piece of fiction, convincing, scientific, tidy. And it was designed to bury a truth so profoundly wrong, so fundamentally aberrant, that they believed even a whisper of it could unravel the public's trust in reality itself. I'm not sure they were wrong about that, but I'm old now. The people who held my leash are mostly gone, and the fear they instilled in me has faded, replaced by a different kind of fear. The fear that I will die with this silence, and that the secret I carry will die with me. Because the thing in that forest, it didn't just kill a man and break another. It's still there. I know it is, and someone else needs to know what is waiting in the deep woods of Washington State, in the place we came to call Zone Red. It all started with a routine assignment given to 2 United States Geological Survey geologists in late September of 1989. The journey for them, for Arthur Davies and Benjamin Miller, began not with a sense of foreboding, but with the mundane drone of a government-issue Ford F-150 pickup truck. I have read their initial log so many times that I feel as if I was there, sitting in the cab with them, smelling the faint scent of stale coffee and vinyl. Arthur Davies was the senior geologist, a man in his late 40s with a quiet, academic demeanor and a career built on meticulous data collection. He believed the world was a solvable puzzle, a series of geological and physical laws that, if studied with enough rigor, would always reveal their logic. He was a man of science, which is to say, he was a man fundamentally unprepared for what was waiting for him. Benjamin Miller was his junior, barely 30, eager, and possessing an intuitive streak that Davies often found professionally irritating. Miller saw patterns where Davies saw randomness. He felt things about a place that Davies would dismiss as unscientific sentimentality. Their mission was simple, almost insultingly so for a man of Davies's caliber. A pair of park rangers stationed in a remote sector of the Olympic National Forest, a region known for its dense, ancient temperate rainforests, had filed a series of increasingly bizarre reports. It started with animal behavior. Deer wandering in circles, placidly chewing their cud until they starved. Bears abandoning their dens weeks before hibernation, found sitting motionless, staring at the sky. Then came the geological readings. Their sensitive seismographs, placed to monitor the minor tremors of the Cascadia subduction zone, were picking up a persistent, low-frequency hum that had no discernible origin. It wasn't tectonic. It wasn't magnetic. It was just there. A soft, constant vibration that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the earth itself. The drive from their field office in Seattle took them west, across the Puget Sound on a ferry, the gray water churning below, the sky a familiar blanket of Pacific Northwest cloud. I can picture them, Davies driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, annoyed at the vague and unscientific nature of the assignment. Miller, in the passenger seat, would have been looking out the window, captivated by the transition from suburbia to the dense, almost primeval wilderness. The deeper they drove into the Olympic Peninsula, the more the modern world fell away. The roads narrowed. The cell service, primitive as it was in 1989, vanished completely. The trees closed in, colossal Douglas firs and western hemlocks forming a canopy so dense it cast the road in a perpetual twilight, even at midday. Their last stop for human contact was a small, ramshackle diner and gas station just outside the park boundaries, a place called the Last Fork. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of frying bacon and damp wool. They sat at the counter, and the proprietor, an old man with a face like a road map of the local logging trails, slid 2 cups of coffee towards them. He asked where they were headed. Davies, ever professional, was vague. Geological survey, up past the Hoh River Basin. The old man, whose name was Hackett according to the after-action interviews we conducted, stopped wiping the counter. He looked at them, a strange, pitying look in his pale blue eyes. "Oh, Basin's fine," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But you ain't going there, are you? The requisition papers for your kind of work? They always send you fellas deeper. You're heading for the Silent Basin, ain't you?" Davies just sipped his coffee, offering nothing. Miller, however, leaned in. "The Silent Basin? I don't see that on our maps." Hackett let out a dry chuckle. "Ain't on any maps. It's what us locals call it. A valley tucked away in the high country. A place the animals avoid. Even the birds don't sing there." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "My granddad, he was a logger back in the 30s, told me stories. Said they tried to clear a section of that basin once. Men got sick. Not a fever sick, a mind sick. Said the trees would bleed, not sap, just red, stained the axes. They abandoned the gear, left it all to rust. Said the place was cursed." Davies pushed his empty cup forward, a dismissive smirk on his face. "Bleeding trees, cursed ground. Sounds like a good story to tell the tourists, old-timer." Hackett just shook his head slowly. "Ain't no tourists go where you're headed, son. Just remember what I said. Some places are old, older than the trees, and they don't like being disturbed." Miller was quiet for the rest of the drive to the trailhead. I imagine Hackett's words had found a home in that intuitive part of his mind, a seed of unease planted in fertile ground. Davies, I'm sure, had already categorized and dismissed it as local folklore, the ramblings of an isolated old man. It was approximately 1400 hours when they reached the designated Park Service road that would take them to the trailhead. And that's when the first undeniable anomaly occurred. It was subtle. Davies was navigating with a standard topographical map and a dashboard-mounted fluid compass. He glanced down at it and frowned. The needle was spinning, slowly, lazily, in a perfect circle. "Damn thing's busted," he muttered, tapping the glass. "Ben, grab your handheld." Miller pulled a high-quality silver compass from his pack. He held it flat in his palm. Its needle was doing the exact same thing, rotating as if it had no north to find. "Mine too, Arthur," Miller said, his voice tight. "That's not possible. Not with this model. Not unless we're sitting on a massive iron deposit." Davies pulled the truck over. "We're not," he said, his voice flat with certainty. He was the geologist. He knew the composition of this land like the back of his hand. There are no significant ferrous deposits anywhere in this region. The magnetic deviation is negligible. They both sat there for a long moment, the only sound the ticking of the cooling engine and the impossibly vast silence of the forest pressing in around them. 2 compasses, both useless. It was a small thing, a mechanical failure they could work around with maps and solar navigation. but it was the first crack in the logical foundation of their world. It was the wilderness pushing back, telling them that its rules were not their rules. They left the truck at the overgrown trailhead, shouldered their heavy packs filled with scientific instruments, surveying tools and supplies for 5 days, and took their first steps into the woods. The air grew colder, and the light began to fade under the oppressive canopy. The silence Hackett had spoken of was no longer a myth. It was a physical presence. It wasn't just quiet. It was dead. There were no insect sounds, no bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The entire forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for them. And deep within those silent trees, something that had been dormant for a very long time was beginning to stir, awakened by the faint, telltale hum of approaching consciousness. The trail was barely a suggestion. A faint path overgrown with ferns and moss that hadn't seen a boot print in years. Every step was a conscious effort, the damp earth sucking at their boots. Davies and Miller moved with the practiced economy of men used to the wilderness, but the silence was a constant, unnerving companion. It wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. According to Miller's early log entries, which were still lucid and detailed at this point, he felt a persistent prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the kind of ancient, primal instinct that tells an animal it is being stalked. He mentioned it to Davies, who, true to form, dismissed it as a psychological reaction to the unfamiliar quiet. "Your brain is trying to fill a sensory void, Ben," Davies had explained, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "It's manufacturing a response because it's not receiving the expected input. It's a textbook psychoacoustic phenomenon." But even Davies, in his own separate log, noted the wrongness of it all. He didn't use words like stalked or predatory. His language was more clinical. Ambient noise levels are below 1 decibel. This is anomalous for a temperate rainforest ecosystem, which should register between 20 and 30 decibels from fauna and wind activity alone. The lack of avian life is particularly noteworthy. It was his way of saying he was scared without admitting it. Their destination for the first night was the abandoned ranger camp, the source of the initial reports. They found it in a small clearing just before dusk. 2 canvas tents, a fire pit cold and gray with ash, and a small folding table. It looked exactly as it should, except for the details. The details were all wrong. On the table sat a metal plate with a half-eaten meal of beans and jerky, a fork resting beside it. A fine layer of dew coated the food, but there were no signs of insects, no scavenging animals, not so much as an ant. It was as if the rangers had simply vanished mid-bite. Inside one of the tents, they found a sleeping bag unrolled, a book lying face down on the pillow. The other tent held their primary objective, the seismological equipment. It was still running, a needle tracing a fine, jagged line on a slowly rotating drum of paper. But overlaid on the familiar squiggles of micro-quakes was another pattern, a perfectly regular low-amplitude wave. The hum. It was real. They could see its signature, a pulse so steady and unnatural it looked less like a geological reading and more like a heartbeat. The most disturbing discovery came from Miller. Tucked under a cot, he found the personal logbook of one of the rangers, a man named Henderson. Most of the pages were filled with mundane observations, weather patterns, trail maintenance notes, animal sightings. But the last entry, dated nearly a week prior, was different. The handwriting was jagged, frantic. It didn't describe what the ranger saw. It described how he saw it. The entry read, October 3rd. The light is wrong. It's been wrong for 2 days. The green isn't green anymore. It's like a photograph that's been left in the sun too long. Faded, washed out. Jim thinks I'm losing my mind, but he sees it too. I know he does. He just won't admit it. It's not in the rocks. It's not in the trees. I looked at my own hands today, and the color was wrong. It's in my head. God help us. It's getting inside our heads. Davies read the entry over Miller's shoulder, his face a mask of stern concentration. He took the book, read it again, and then closed it with a sharp snap. Stress-induced visual distortion, he declared, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Isolation, coupled with the constant low-frequency hum. It could be affecting their inner ears, their equilibrium. That can lead to a host of perceptual anomalies. We'll document it, but we need to focus on the geological data. That's what's real. They made their own camp that night, a few hundred yards away from the rangers' silent tents. They built a fire, the flames seeming to push back the oppressive darkness, but not the silence. The fire crackled and spat, but the sounds felt small, swallowed by the immense quiet of the basin. They tried to talk, to maintain a sense of normalcy, discussing the next day's survey route, analyzing the seismic data. But their words were hollow, their conversation strained. Every pause was filled by that terrible listening silence. They were two men, armed with the pinnacle of modern science, sitting on the edge of a great and ancient mystery. And for the first time in their professional lives, they were beginning to understand that their tools, their knowledge, their logic might not be enough. The forest didn't care about their degrees or their instruments. It operated on a different set of principles, and it was slowly, patiently, beginning to teach them the rules. The first night was a siege of the mind. Sleep came in fits and starts, shallow and unrefreshing, haunted by the profound, unnatural stillness of the forest. I've been in isolation training at Fort Bragg. I know what true silence is. It's the sterile, padded quiet of an anechoic chamber. That's a dead quiet. This was different. This was a living silence, an attentive one. Miller described it in his log as feeling like the pause a predator takes before it strikes. Every natural sound that should have been there but wasn't was a source of escalating dread. The wind, which they could see moving the high branches of the firs, made no sound. Not a whisper, not a rustle. The flames of their campfire burned with a strange, visual intensity, but produced only the faintest crackle, as if the sound was being absorbed by the air itself. At approximately 0200 hours, Davies was startled awake by a sound. It was the sharp snap of a twig, a classic cinematic horror movie trope, and his rational mind immediately went to work dismissing it. A deer, a raccoon, the wood in the fire pit settling. He lay in his sleeping bag, his heart pounding, listening. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. He was about to drift off again when he heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't a snap. It was a soft, dragging sound. A rhythmic shush. 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 Like something heavy being pulled through the damp ferns and moss. He sat bolt upright, straining to hear. The sound was methodical, unhurried, and it was circling their camp just beyond the ring of firelight. Miller was awake too. Davies could see his silhouette in the adjacent tent, a frozen shadow. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The fear was a palpable thing in the air between them, thick and cold. The dragging sound continued for what felt like an eternity. My analysis of the audio from their personal recorders suggests it was actually 17 minutes, before it slowly faded into the distance. They didn't sleep for the rest of the night. They sat by the fire, a rifle across Davies' lap, until the first weak light of dawn penetrated the canopy. In the daylight, their fear seemed foolish, a product of darkness and exhaustion. It was a bear, Davies said, his voice firm, trying to convince himself as much as Miller. A big one, maybe dragging a fresh kill. That would explain the sound. Miller didn't argue, but he spent the morning canvassing the perimeter of their camp. He found no tracks, no broken branches, no sign of a bear or any other large animal. It was as if the sound had been produced by nothing at all. This discovery was unsettling, but it was overshadowed by something far stranger. As they were packing their gear to begin the day's survey, Davies picked up one of the sealed plastic bags containing a rock sample they had collected the previous afternoon. He stopped, staring at it. "Ben, come look at this." Miller came over. The bag, which Davies had personally heat-sealed the night before, was now open. The seal was cleanly broken, not torn or chewed. Inside, the core sample of basalt, a dark, charcoal gray rock, was now coated in a fine, uniform layer of pale gray dust, almost like ash. A dust that hadn't been there when he sealed the bag. "Did you open this?" Davies asked, his voice sharp. Miller shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, I never touched it." Davies, the meticulous scientist, ran through the possibilities. A chemical reaction with the plastic? Impossible. A form of rapid oxidation? Unprecedented and contrary to all known geological science. He emptied the dust into a sterile container for later analysis, his movements precise and mechanical. A man desperately clinging to procedure in the face of the impossible. They tried to put it out of their minds, to focus on the mission. Their task for the day was to move deeper into the basin, setting up a new array of seismic sensors to try and triangulate the source of the hum. As they hiked, the forest grew older, stranger. The trees were larger, draped in thick curtains of club moss that gave them the appearance of ancient green-bearded giants. And it was here, in the heart of this ancient grove, that the true horror of the place began to reveal itself. It wasn't a sound in the night or a mysterious dust. It was an attack on their most fundamental tool of perception. It started with Miller. He stopped mid-stride, staring at a thick carpet of moss on a fallen log. "Arthur," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "look at the moss." Davies, annoyed at another delay, sighed. "What about it, Ben? It's moss. Isothecium myoceroides, if you want to be precise." "No," Miller said, shaking his head. "The color. It looks sick." Davies looked closer. The moss should have been a vibrant, almost electric green. Instead, it was a dull, washed-out sage, as if the color was being leached out of it. He knelt down, touching it. The texture was right, soft and damp, but the color was undeniably wrong. "It's a blight," Davies said, standing up. "Some kind of fungus or mineral deficiency in the soil." But even as he said it, he was looking at the ferns, at the leaves of the huckleberry bushes. They were all the same dull, faded green. It was the entire forest. He tried to rationalize it, to find a single, logical explanation. But then he looked up, through a gap in the canopy, at the sky. It should have been a crisp autumn blue. Instead, it was a flat, lifeless gray, the color of slate. A growing, ice-cold dread began to pool in Davies' stomach. He slowly, deliberately, pulled a brand new, sealed roll of Kodachrome film from his pack. It was the gold standard, famous for its rich color saturation. He unrolled a few inches of the slick, orange-brown film leader. It looked normal. Then he held it up to the light, looked at it, and then looked at the world around him. He felt his scientific mind, his entire logical worldview, begin to fracture. Because the problem wasn't the trees. It wasn't the sky. He looked at the bright red of his own jacket, a color he'd chosen specifically for its high visibility in the wilderness. It was a muddy, indistinct brown. He looked at his own hands, at the pink flesh, and the pale white of his fingernails. They were shades of gray, like a black and white photograph. The color was vanishing, not from the world, but from their ability to see it. He turned to Miller, and the look of pure, unadulterated terror he saw on his young colleague's face confirmed the horrifying truth. They weren't just observing an anomaly, they were becoming part of it. In his logbook that evening, in a hand that was now noticeably less steady, Arthur Davies wrote the entry that would become the cornerstone of our investigation. The words that chilled me to the bone when I first read them in the sterile confines of my lab, thousands of miles away. "My God," he wrote, "it's not the world. It's us. We're going blind to color." The hours that followed that realization were a blur of controlled panic. Davies and Miller, two men of science, were suddenly faced with a phenomenon that defied every biological and physical law they had ever learned. Their first instinct was to troubleshoot themselves. They checked each other's pupils. Normal. They went through a neurological field checklist: balance, reflex, simple cognition. Normal. Yet the world continued to fade. The subtle browns of the tree bark, the faint yellows of the dying leaves, the deep blue of Miller's backpack, all collapsed into a spectrum of gray. It was, as Davies described it in a strained, terrified voice on their audio log, like watching a television set slowly lose its color saturation, knob by knob, until all that was left was monochrome. Their training kicked in, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos. They decided to document it. They took photographs, dozens of them, hoping the camera's impartial lens would capture the true colors they could no longer see. They described the fading in their journals with a frantic, obsessive detail, attempting to quantify the unquantifiable. Miller tried to create a new color scale, using shades of gray to represent the vibrant colors he remembered. The green of the hemlock needles is a dark gray, about an 80% black, he wrote, while the sky is a flat, uniform 30%. The red of the emergency first aid kit is indistinguishable from the dark brown of the leather on my boots. This process, this act of documentation, was more than just science. It was a lifeline. It was a way to prove to themselves that they weren't going mad. The problem was, the world they were now in was a profoundly dangerous place for someone who couldn't perceive color. A clear, shallow stream looked identical to a patch of dark, wet stone. Edible berries were indistinguishable from their poisonous lookalikes. The subtle changes in vegetation that might indicate solid ground versus a marshy bog were completely lost to them. The forest, which had once been a complex tapestry of information, was now a flat, treacherous landscape of confusing shapes and shades. This is the point in the narrative where I, Eris Thorne, officially entered the story, though I didn't know it at the time. Back at USAMRIID, we received a highly encrypted telex from a listening post at Fort Lewis, Washington. It was a Priority 1 flag, routed from the Department of the Interior through to the Department of Defense. The telex contained the fragmented automated burst transmission from the Rangers seismic station. It included the anomalous hum, but it also included a single garbled audio file from an open microphone in their tent. Most of it was static, but our signals intelligence analysts managed to isolate a few phrases. "Can't see the color. All gray. In my head." This, coupled with the Rangers' sudden silence, was enough to trigger a low-level alert. My department, the Epidemic Intelligence Division, was put on a preliminary standby. The working theory at that point was still a neurotoxin, a naturally occurring agent, perhaps a hallucinogenic mold or fungus that was affecting the Rangers. The mission for Davies and Miller was, in part, to collect geological and botanical samples to confirm or deny this theory. We knew they were in there. We just didn't know they were walking directly into the fire. The logs that we recovered later paint a horrifying picture of their second night. The monochrome world was disorienting enough, but as darkness fell, a new element was introduced. Their vision, now limited to shades of gray, began to be tinted. It started at the periphery, a faint, rosy, pinkish hue, like the world was being viewed through a cheap-colored filter. Davies, ever the rationalist, attributed it to retinal fatigue, the optical equivalent of a phantom limb. Our photoreceptors, specifically the cones, are being deprived of stimulus, he theorized into their recorder, his voice a tight wire of forced calm. The brain may be generating a false signal to compensate, a ghost color. But the ghost was growing stronger. Over the next few hours, the faint pink deepened, crawling from the edges of their vision toward the center. It was no longer a tint, it was a stain. A viscous, blood-colored dye seeping into their monochrome reality. By midnight, the transformation was complete. Everything they looked at was red. The towering trunks of the fir trees were the deep, flat red of a stop sign. The ground, a carpet of moss and dirt, was the glistening, wet red of an open wound. Their hands, held up in front of their faces, were the uniform, matte red of dried blood. They shone their flashlights into the woods, and the powerful white beams cut a tunnel through a world made of nothing but shades of crimson. The fire they built was the most terrifying of all. The flames were a brighter, more intense red, dancing against a backdrop of darker red, casting flickering red shadows on the red trees. It was a landscape painted by a madman, a vision of hell, rendered in a single, maddening color. This was the true nature of the anomaly. It wasn't just sensory deprivation, it was sensory replacement. It stripped away the complex beauty of the world and replaced it with a monolithic, psychological torture. They were trapped in a world with no contrast, no definition. A steep drop-off just a few feet away was invisible, just another patch of red against red. A deep pool of water was indistinguishable from the solid ground next to it. Their log entries from this period become almost unreadable, a scrawl of terror and disorientation. Miller's entries devolved into single, repeated words. Red, 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 red. Davies fought to maintain his scientific detachment, but the strain was evident. The single wavelength visual field makes depth perception functionally impossible, he wrote. Every object, regardless of distance, appears as a flat plane of color. Navigating is no longer a matter of skill, but of blind luck. We are effectively blind. They were trapped, not by walls, but by perception itself. And on the seismic audio log, which was still running, a new sound began to emerge, buried beneath the steady hum. It was the faint, almost inaudible sound of a human voice, weeping. The transition from psychological horror to a desperate fight for survival happened on the third day. Davies, his scientific mind shattered by the red world, made a command decision. They were aborting the mission. Their only goal now was to get back to the truck. It was a journey of only a few miles, a hike they had completed in under 3 hours on the way in. Now, it was a terrifying, almost impossible odyssey. Every step was a gamble. They moved by touch, one hand on a tree trunk, the other sweeping the ground in front of them with a trekking pole, feeling for holes, for water, for the edge of the trail they could no longer see. The world was a featureless crimson maze. The friction between the two men, which had been simmering for days, finally boiled over. Miller, younger and more prone to panic, wanted to move faster, to just run in the direction he thought was right. Davies, older and more methodical, insisted on their slow, careful shuffle. I have the audio log from that morning. It is a harrowing document. We have to move, Arthur. Miller's voice is high-pitched, cracking with strain. We stay here, we die. If we rush, we die faster. Davies' voice is a low, ragged growl. You can't see the cliffs. You can't see the ravines. Use your head, damn it. My head is full of red, Miller screams back, his voice breaking into a sob. I can't think. I just want it to stop. They were coming apart. The anomaly wasn't just attacking their eyes, it was attacking the very core of their sanity, exploiting their fear, their frustration, their dwindling hope. It was turning them against each other. The final tragic event of their partnership was a direct result of this sensory nightmare. They were crossing what they believed to be a flat, open clearing. Davies was in the lead, tapping his pole, shuffling his feet. Miller was a few yards behind him. According to Davies' final coherent log entry, he heard a sound, a soft gasp, followed by the scrape of a boot on loose rock. He turned around. Ben Miller was gone. He wasn't there. Davies called his name. Ben. Ben, where are you? The only answer was the maddening, silent red world. He shuffled forward toward the spot where he had last seen his partner. He swept his pole in front of him, and it found nothing but air. He had stopped just at the edge of a ravine, a steep 20-foot drop onto a bed of rock and deadfall that was completely invisible. Just another shade of red against red. Miller, in his panic, in his desperate haste, had not been as careful. He had walked right off the edge. Davies stood there, at the edge of the unseen cliff, screaming Miller's name into the red void. There was no response. The silence that answered him was absolute, profound. And now, it was the silence of solitude. He was alone, utterly and completely alone, in a world made of a single, soul-crushing color. My team and I, piecing this together weeks later from the logs and the evidence at the scene, could only imagine his state of mind. His partner was gone, likely dead. He was lost, effectively blind, and trapped in a sensory torture chamber. The scientific part of his brain, the part that had defined his entire life, was useless. The world no longer followed its rules. All that was left was the animal brain, the part that knows only fear and the instinct to survive. And so, Arthur Davies began to wonder. His journal entries from this point forward are a testament to a mind coming unstitched. The neat, scientific script devolves into a desperate, barely legible scroll. He no longer writes in full sentences, but in fragmented thoughts. The red has a sound, a hum. It's the same hum from the machine, vibrating in my teeth, in my bones. Miller knew. He said it followed sound. Are my thoughts a sound? Can it hear me thinking? He was losing the boundary between his senses. The red world had a sound. The constant hum was a color. It was a textbook case of synesthesia, but not the benign, poetic kind. This was a weaponized synesthesia, a forced rewiring of the brain's fundamental circuitry, designed to break a person from the inside out. He wandered for days. We tracked his path later by the occasional discarded food wrapper and the faint trail he left. He didn't travel in a straight line. He walked in circles, in spirals, doubling back on himself. He was a rat in a crimson maze. He ate his remaining rations cold. He drank from streams he could only find by the sound of running water. He slept in hollow logs, curling into a fetal position, closing his eyes only to find that the red was still there, burned onto the inside of his eyelids. The entity, the anomaly, the whatever it was no longer just a passive environmental effect. In his fractured state, Davies became convinced it was intelligent, that it was hunting him. He writes about seeing things in the red, shapes moving in the periphery, tall, thin, the color of deeper red. They watch from the trees. They don't have faces. Were these hallucinations brought on by starvation and stress? Or was he finally seeing the architects of his prison? We'll never know. The one encounter that stands out, the one that I believe represents the direct contact in his final days, is described in a single, terrifying passage. He'd stumbled upon a small cave, seeking shelter for the night. As he sat in the absolute darkness, he became aware of a change. The hum, the constant vibration in his skull, was getting louder, more intense, and with it, the red color he saw, even with his eyes closed, was brightening, shifting from a dark crimson to a brilliant, painful scarlet. And in the center of that scarlet light, a shape began to form. A perfect black circle. A hole in the red. A spot of absolute nothingness. He wrote that it felt like it was looking at him, that it was a doorway. And from that doorway, he felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the cave. It was a coldness of the soul, a profound and ancient emptiness. He scrambled out of the cave screaming and ran blindly through the red night. That was the last coherent entry in his journal. The pages after that are filled with nothing but jagged, meaningless scratches, the frantic scribbling of a mind that has been pushed past the breaking point. Weeks later, on a foggy morning in early November, a long-haul trucker driving south on Highway 101, nearly 30 miles from the edge of the quarantine zone we would later establish, saw a figure stumble out of the woods and onto the shoulder of the road. It was a man, emaciated, bearded, his clothes in tatters. His face was blank, his mouth open, babbling nonsense. The trucker stopped, got out, and saw the man's eyes. He told the state police later that he would never forget those eyes. They were wide, unfocused, and the sclera, the whites of his eyes, were stained with a faint but permanent reddish hue, like old blood vessels had burst and bled into the tissue. The man was Arthur Davies. He never spoke another coherent word for the rest of his life. He was taken to a secure medical facility where he would live out his remaining years in a catatonic state, sometimes tracing patterns on the wall with his finger, his gaze fixed on a world that only he could see. My team was activated the moment the state police identified Arthur Davies. The mission, codenamed Operation Bleach, was twofold. First, find and recover the body of Benjamin Miller and any and all equipment from their camp. Second, and more importantly, was containment. We were to establish the true nature and boundary of the phenomenon and recommend a permanent quarantine protocol. We flew into McCord Air Force Base under the cover of night and were driven to a forward staging area just outside the Olympic National Park. Our team was composed of myself as the lead bio-containment specialist, a physicist from Lawrence Livermore named Dr. Evelyn Reed, who specialized in exotic wave phenomena, and a 4-man special operations retrieval team from the Army's most secretive units. We were not geologists or park rangers. We were the government's cleanup crew, the people they call when things go sideways in a way that can't be explained by conventional science. Our descent into the lair was not a descent into a cave or a bunker. It was a slow, methodical push into the silent basin itself. We wore fully enclosed, positive pressure hazardous environment suits. Our helmets were equipped with independent oxygen supplies and, most critically, multi-layered polarized visor systems designed to filter specific wavelengths of light. We were taking no chances. The moment we crossed the invisible threshold into the basin, our instruments went haywire. The ambient hum Dr. Reed had predicted was there, a low, thrumming vibration that our suit sensors registered as a complex, multi-layered infrasonic wave. The silence was the first thing that hit you, even through the helmet speakers. It was a dead zone. The forest looked normal through our filtered visors, a world of greens and browns, but it was a silent movie, a beautiful, dead diorama. The retrieval team found Miller's body at the bottom of the ravine, just as Davies' log had indicated. It was a grim, clinical task. We retrieved their campsite, bagging every piece of equipment, every logbook, every scrap of paper. Davies' and Miller's meticulous records were our map, our guide through this nightmare. The lair, the epicenter of the anomaly, was where their logs indicated the hum was strongest. As we moved deeper, Dr. Reed's instruments began to register a frightening increase in the wave's amplitude. The very air seemed to vibrate. The retrieval team members, hardened combat veterans, grew tense. Through the helmet comms, I could hear their breathing grow heavier. This was a battlefield they had not been trained for. The architecture of the forest itself seemed to become hostile. Trees grew in strange, unnatural spirals. Patches of ground that looked solid would be soft and marshy. The laws of perspective seemed to subtly warp, making distances hard to judge, even with our technology. It felt like the place itself was trying to confuse us, to lead us astray. We found the epicenter in a small sunken hollow, a place where the trees grew stunted and twisted, their bark peeling away in sickly sheets. And in the center of that hollow, half buried in the moss and earth, was the source. It was not a geological formation, it was a machine. It was old, angular, and made of a dull, non-reflective metal alloy I didn't recognize. It was roughly the size of a refrigerator, with a series of what looked like emitters or antennae pointing down into the ground. On a corroded metal plate, I could just make out the stenciled words, "Property of U.S. Gov. DARPA, Geophysical Resonance, Emitter, XC7. It was a ghost from a forgotten war. Dr. Reed approached it cautiously, her own handheld sensor shrieking with proximity warnings. "This is it," she said over the comms, her voice tight with a mixture of terror and scientific awe. "It's active. The energy readings are off the scale. It's drawing power from the ground itself, using the specific mineral composition of this basin as a giant battery and amplification array. It's self-sustaining." Before we could investigate further, the final guardian, the last defense of this place, revealed itself. It wasn't a monster. It was a failsafe. A low-frequency pulse emanated from the device, a wave designed to interfere with electronics. Our helmet comms filled with static. Our visor displays flickered and died. We were suddenly plunged into a terrifying, isolated silence, each of us alone in our suits. Then, our suit lights went out. We were in absolute darkness, miles deep in a hostile wilderness, with an active, unknown piece of advanced technology humming a few feet away. This was the puzzle. The device was designed to prevent anyone with modern technology from getting near it or disabling it. But Davies's and Miller's logbooks, their old analog paper and ink artifacts, had given me the key. I remembered one of Davies's last frantic scrawls. "The hum changes with the light. Morning light is a high pitch, night is low." It was a long shot, a desperate guess based on a dying man's ravings. I fumbled in my sample kit for the high-intensity chemical light sticks we carried for marking. I cracked one. A brilliant cold green light flooded the hollow, and the hum from the machine changed pitch, rising to an almost inaudible squeal. Then, it cut out completely. The oppressive vibration in the air vanished. My helmet lights flickered back on. The comms crackled to life. "Eris, what did you do?" It was Reed's voice. I had rebooted the system. The sudden, intense, single-wavelength light had overloaded its primitive optical sensors, triggering a temporary shutdown. We had a window. We stood there, breathing heavily, looking at the silent alien machine at our feet. And as the door to the mystery swung open, the air that hit us was cold and smelled of ozone and secrets that should have stayed buried forever. The culmination of our mission was not a battle, but a revelation. With the DARPA device temporarily dormant, Dr. Reed was able to conduct a close-range scan. What she discovered was terrifying in its elegant simplicity. The machine wasn't broadcasting a signal in the traditional sense. It was generating a complex resonance field, a standing wave tuned to the specific frequencies of human consciousness. It didn't project an image or a sound. It vibrated the very cells of the optical nerve and the auditory cortex. It forced the brain to create the signal internally. It wasn't showing its victims a red world. It was making their own minds produce it. It was a perfect, inescapable prison built inside the target's own skull. The final devastating piece of the puzzle didn't come from the machine itself, but from the classified mission file I was allowed to read only after our extraction. It was hand-delivered to me in a locked briefcase at Fort Meade by a man in a gray suit who never told me his name. The file was thin, its contents typed on a manual typewriter. Its title was Project Chroma Shift 1974. It was a DARPA program from the height of the Cold War, an attempt to create a new class of non-lethal psychological weapon. A device that could incapacitate entire battalions of enemy soldiers without firing a single shot, by collapsing their sensory input, inducing terror, confusion, and temporary blindness. The report stated the project had been a failure. The effect was too unpredictable, too dependent on the unique geology of the test site. The prototype, Emitter XC7, was deemed too dangerous to move and was officially decommissioned and buried in its remote test location in the Olympic National Forest, left to be forgotten. But it hadn't failed, and it hadn't decommissioned. It had done something far worse. It had matured. For 15 years, it had sat there, silently drawing power from the earth, its resonance field slowly and permanently altering the very fabric of the basin. It had become a part of the local ecosystem, a technological cancer that had gone feral. We hadn't stumbled upon a natural anomaly or an alien entity. We had found one of our own monsters, left to fester in the wilderness. My final act in the field was not one of heroism, but of complicity. There was no way to turn the device off permanently without a catastrophic energy release. Our orders were clear. Containment. My sacrifice was not my life, but my integrity. I stood there and watched as the Special Ops team placed seismic charges, not to destroy the device, but to create a series of small, controlled landslides, forever burying the hollow and the machine under thousands of tons of rock and earth. We were hiding the evidence. Then we began the second phase of my mission, the creation of the lie. I spent the next 2 weeks in a windowless room with Dr. Reed and 2 men from the intelligence community, drafting the official report. We invented the neurotoxin, we fabricated the chemical structure, the geological release mechanism, the predicted rate of dissipation. We created a perfect scientific explanation for what happened to the Rangers and to Davies and Miller. It was my job as a bio-containment expert to make it believable. And I did. My work was impeccable. The final gut-wrenching moment of the operation was the day we signed off on the quarantine zone. We established a perimeter several miles wide around the basin. I personally helped write the text for the warning signs that would be posted along its edge. Warning, they read, in stark black letters on a field of yellow. U.S. government property. No trespassing. Area closed due to unstable geological formations and risk of toxic gas release. Every word was a lie, and as I watched the first sign being hammered into a tree, I felt a part of myself die. We weren't building a fence to keep people out. We were building a cage to keep a monster in. The operation ended. We were debriefed, sworn to a secrecy so absolute that the threats were never spoken aloud, merely implied. And then, there was only silence. A blinding, deafening silence that lasted for over 30 years. The epilogue to my story is the life I have lived since. I awoke, not from a blast, but from a state of moral anesthesia in a sterile debriefing facility. The men in suits, the ones who don't have names, sat across a steel table from me. They didn't need to raise their voices. The horror they represented was bureaucratic, absolute. They took my old life, my real name, my history, and they burned it. In its place, they gave me Eris Thorne, a new identity, a quiet, early retirement on a generous pension, and a simple, unspoken command. Forget. I was debriefed for a week. They asked me the same questions over and over, polishing the cover story, ensuring my version matched the fiction we had created. They showed me photographs of Davies in the hospital, his eyes forever stained. He's a tragic victim of a natural phenomenon, Doctor, the lead debriefer said, his voice devoid of any emotion. It's important for his family's peace of mind that this is the only story, the only truth. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of compassion. My last act as a man of science was to betray it completely. I saw Arthur Davies one last time, through a one-way mirror at a secure wing of Walter Reed. He was sitting in a chair, staring at a blank wall, his hands tracing patterns in the air. A nurse told me that sometimes, in the middle of the night, he would wake up screaming. Not words, but a single, agonizing note. A sound of pure terror. She said his eyes, even in the dark, seemed to glow with a faint, residual red. That image is burned into my memory. I have lived a quiet life since then. A ghost in a suburban town. I never married. I never had children. How could I? I was a lie. A walking, breathing classified document. The paranoia they instilled in me became a part of my DNA. For years, I would see them, the watchers, in a parked car down the street, in the face of a man reading a newspaper too intently at a cafe. Maybe they were real. Maybe they were just ghosts from my own broken psyche. It no longer matters. But the silence has lasted long enough. A few weeks ago, I was browsing an online forum for Pacific Northwest hikers. A foolish indulgence. A way of looking at the bars of my cage from the inside. I found a post from a young hiker who claimed he'd gotten lost and strayed into a restricted zone somewhere in the Olympics. He wrote about how the woods went quiet, how his compass started spinning. And then he wrote the sentence that made me decide to make this tape. He wrote, "The weirdest thing was the color. It was late afternoon, but all the greens looked gray, like something was wrong with my eyes. The pattern. The pattern is starting again. Maybe the landslides didn't hold. Maybe the device is expanding its reach. Or maybe it was never truly contained at all. They told me the effect was confined by the unique geology of that basin, but they lied about everything else. Why should I believe them about that? They gave me a new name, a new life, and told me to forget. But I can't. Because sometimes, late at night, when the house is completely quiet and the world is asleep, I can still hear the static. A low, faint hum on the edge of my hearing. And I know it's still listening. So, that's the story of Zone Red. A story that began with a strange hum on a seismograph and ended in a lifetime of silence. A story that proves the most terrifying monsters are the ones we build ourselves and then pretend we've forgotten. The official report blames a geological neurotoxin, a convenient act of God. But you and I, we know the truth now. It wasn't geology. It was a weapon. And the only thing it poisoned was the truth. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story made you think or look over your shoulder, support the channel with a like and subscribe, and be sure to share your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Until next time, be careful in the quiet places, because sometimes the silence isn't empty. It's just waiting for a signal.